What if I told you the Irish aren't who you think they are? And much of what you've been led to believe isn't really true. That you've been misled at best, lied to at worst. That the word Celtic may not mean what you think, or even mean much at all. In the unforgiving North Atlantic, there exists an ancient land of fierce rain and deep bogs, of green fields and wild cliffs, a misty island of mysticism and druidry, where in its earth and mounds lie veils to another world. They call this land Ireland. And when you think of Ireland, what springs to mind? Green fields, cosy cottages, Guinness settling on a bar top, wild cliffs, red hair, leprechauns. But if I asked you something deeper, who are the Irish? For most of you, the answer is simple: a Celtic people. A Celtic people known for their goodwill, warmth and openness, known for their lively spirit, partying abilities, alcohol tolerance, and refusing to allow their kindness to be mistaken for weakness, loved everywhere they go, mourned when they leave, remembered always for not settling, for keeping their fighting spirit even when it cost them everything. An image drawn from deep Celtic origins, said to stretch across the millennia. But where did that idea actually come from? Because when you look for the Celts in Ireland, they're surprisingly difficult to find. It has always begun quietly, a whisper, somewhere along the way. Through school or family, we learn that we are a Celtic people, that our ancestors mainly arrived here in the Iron Age, bringing with them language, new gods, and a different way of life. Anything more than a whisper, and it falls in on itself. Our language, Gaeilge, becomes a relic of these people. Our legends, stories of heroes and warriors, become their stories. Our old gods of earth and sky are said to have come from elsewhere.
We learn of their struggles with Rome and their name coming from the Greeks.
And when you follow that idea back, it actually takes shape in the 19th and early 20th century.
With the emergence of scientific fields such as anthropology and archaeology,
historians around Europe scrambled to find the origins of their respective people. In Ireland, older native annals were gradually set aside in favour of a new kind of scholarship, one that began to weave things together: legend, archaeology, and language into a single, coherent story. A story of waves, of arrivals, of Celtic peoples coming over from the continent and shaping what Ireland would become. And over time, the idea took hold, reinforced by nationalist movements, which found in Celtic Ireland a powerful alternative narrative to a Germanic England. A worthy narrative, one at a rapid glance needs no questioning, for the identity it has bestowed upon the Irish people has fueled powerful action, and for generations it has shaped how the Irish see themselves and how they've acted in the world. But what if it was all built on shaky grounds? Over time, every people reshapes the story they tell about themselves. When a narrative takes hold, they either adapt within it or risk being forgotten to history. Ireland, was no exception. So, how did the Irish once see themselves? And how did this image change over time? If we turn to the old Irish annals, with their stories of battles and gods, we begin to see how the Irish once imagined their own beginnings. The medieval Irish text, called the Lebor Gabála Érenn, helps us set the stage for their arrival. The story is as such. It tells of a people who once ruled this island, the Tuatha Danann, not mere mortals, but gods and goddesses, custodians of art and druidry with a warrior nature. They had claimed Ireland from the previous stewards, known as the Fir Bolg, and from the chaotic forces, known as the Fómhaire, and for a time they ruled, until another people arrived, a mortal race of men, known as the Milesians, said to have come from Iberia. They came to conquer. The Tuatha Danann were driven from the surface of the land into the mounds below, while the Milesians took the world above, and from them came the people who would be known as the Gaels. A story that ultimately placed the origins of the Irish into a coherent worldview, but that worldview was not of the Celtic world, but one trying to compete with the Bible and the classical world. For the very journey of the Milesians from Far East mimics that of the plight of the Israelites. In fact, you are far more likely to encounter references of Noah and his ark than anything we would now call of Celtic origin.
However, the deeper roots of such stories likely reach back into Ireland's pagan past.
When the oral tradition was used to weave genealogy, history, and law into a coherent worldview by the Druids and later the Fili. But down the centuries, once it had reached the monk's quill, the stories had ultimately been transformed to fit within a Christian understanding of the world. And in that form, they endured. The old annals would serve as a window into Irish origins for generations to come, until, in the 19th century, they would be questioned in the light of a new kind of inquiry. Under the interrogating eye of science, the new inquisitors would find holes in the story of the Irish annals, recognizing the imprint of Christian thought within them. So, they turned to comparison, testing them against myths from across Europe, organizing the tangled threads of archaeology, literature, and language. They began inching away from the annals as a complete account of the past, and towards something new. Within the myths, they began to discover older echoes of people, long before the medieval commitment to parchment. In the Irish saga, Tambo Cullinane, for example, we can find remnants of local ancient kingship, gods and spirits of the land, codes of honour, and ancient traditions such as Ogham, fragments that seem to belong to something older than the medieval world that recorded them. And when these fragments were set beside those of other European traditions, a pattern began to emerge, one that would come to be known as Celtic. In time, this new way of seeing the past began to take hold. Celtic became a way to organise the fragments, to bring order to language, archaeology, and myth. It offered a foundation from which scholars could begin to see connections, not just within Ireland, but across Europe. A shared past stretching deep into antiquity. And over the decades, this idea cemented in, taking its place as part of how Ireland understood herself. But it was never fixed, for as archaeologists began searching the soil of Ireland and more evidence came to light, the picture began to shift once again.
The idea of a clear Celtic arrival, of a single defining moment or multiple waves of moments began to slip away.
If one wants to veer into the ages of the past, they must look down into the soil below. From artifacts, buildings, bones, and a bit of guesswork, we can slowly weave together how life was in bygone days. Architecture, such as Hadrian's Wall, shines light on Roman presence in England. Neolithic tombs such as Newgrange reveal to us our ancestors' knowledge of the stars, and the bones of Rattling Man and his community unveils times of great change in Bronze Age Ireland. So, one has to ask themselves, if there was a single or even multiple movements of Celtic people onto the island of Ireland, enough to completely replace prior lineages, surely you'd be able to see that change within the ground. The narrative of Celtic migration usually places their arrival in Ireland during the Iron Age, sometime in the last millennium BC. And if that were the case, we would expect to see it in the soil, in artifacts, and in the remains of daily life. We would expect a clear shift, but when we look, there's actually little to be found. Little in the ways of metalwork, little in the ways of burials. In fact, for long stretches of this period, the archaeological record falls strangely quiet, as if the people had slipped through the veil. Instead, what emerges is something far less dramatic, a picture of continuity, such as the persistence of late Bronze Age burial practices, the continued use, even reuse, of ancient sites like Tara, not the signs of a sweeping arrival, but of a world carrying on. It is only in the final centuries before the turn of the millennium that something begins to emerge. Metalwork starts to appear in new forms, taking on styles from Central Europe, what we now call the Latane, a clear break at least in appearance. But here's the twist. This Latane style does not arrive with a people, but with influence. The evidence suggests instead of a mass arrival, local craftsmen adopted a foreign aesthetic. And even then, its uses appear limited, confined largely to an elite layer of society. For most people living in Ireland at the time, the world beneath their feet remained much the same. This raises another possibility, that language and identity do not always leave a clear trace in the ground, that a people can change how they speak and how they see themselves without any great movement of bodies or objects, that such shifts may happen not through invasion, but through influence, prestige, and power. A view echoed by the American anthropologist David W. Anthony. If there had been a large-scale movement of people into Ireland during the Iron Age, we would expect to see it, not in language but in the ground, in burials and settlements, in the material traces people leave behind, and yet it simply is not there. Iron Age sites are exceedingly rare when set against what came before. Instead of disruption, what we find is continuity, a world that appears to carry on. The reuse of ancient places, sites like Lough Crew, continuing into the Iron Age. Even the grey centres of power seem to echo the past, with places like Navan Fort possibly mimicking earlier monuments such as the Mound of Hostages at Tara. It really only is in some of the artefacts that something begins to shift. The emergence of rare Latane-style metalwork suggests a break in appearance, but not necessarily in people. These objects speak less of invasion and more of connection, of ideas travelling, and of styles being adopted. Markers of status, identity, and belonging within a wider world. And with that, the picture changes.
What once looked like the arrival of a new people began to look like something else entirely.
It was this Latine-style disruption in the metalwork of the first millennium BC that long stood as the strongest indication of new people arriving in Ireland. But now, that evidence appears far less certain than it once did. What was once taken as proof of migration, whether in a single wave or many,
has, over time, come under increasing doubt.
in the 2010s, a new kind of magic was quietly discovered that began to change the picture once again. For the first time, we were able to look beyond the soil and into the very material that makes us and our ancestors. Through genetic sequencing, a different kind of evidence emerged. So now, we shift our focus away from the ground and inward to the final nail in the coffin. The Iron Age archaeological record offers us a deeply informative, but ultimately limited picture of life in these bygone ages. But fortunately for us, we can now dive deeper into the tangled webs of our ancestors' bones and begin to weave something clearer about where they came from and how they arrived. So, what does the picture reveal? To understand what the picture paints, we must peel back the layers and go back in time. To the Mesolithic period, to a people known as the Western hunter-gatherers. These are the first layer. The Western hunter-gatherers arrived in Ireland shortly after the end of the last glacial maximum, at the opening of the Holocene period we still inhabit today. These were largely nomadic communities, whose lives were shaped by the land around them. Some relied on fish, shellfish, and fruit, while others hunted within the vast forest that once covered the island. Genetically, these early Irish belonged to the European Western hunter-gatherer haplogroup. All carried pale-eyed pigmentation, mostly blue eyes, yet lacked the genetic variants associated with pale skin, giving them a rather unique look. Travelling on to the Neolithic period, the second layer of Irish ancestry is established. These are the people known as the Neolithic farmers. These farmers were some of the first to domesticate animals, such as cattle, sheep, and pigs, along with cereal crops, which came to largely replace the wild foods relied upon by the hunter-gatherers. Over time, farming reshaped the rhythms of daily life. Genetically, these farmers belonged to the early European farmer haplogroup. Unlike the hunter-gatherers who preceded them, they carried genetic variants associated with lighter skin pigmentation and tended towards brown eyes. The last and most critical layer will require us to travel to the Bronze Age, a time of a great genetic upheaval in Ireland. By the early Bronze Age, new populations were on the move in Europe, and Ireland was drawn into this wider transformation. Archaeologists refer to this movement as the Bell Beaker phenomenon, named after the distinctive inverted drinking vessels found across the continent. The arrival of these people onto the island triggered a profound population turnover, replacing up to 90% of the prior Neolithic ancestry. There is no clearer example of this population than Rathlin Man. Discovered on Rathlin Island in 2006, he lived during the early Bronze Age, around 2000 to 1600 BC. In 2016, his genome, along with others from the same site, was sequenced by a research team led from Trinity College Dublin, giving us an unprecedented window into the ancestry of Ireland's Bronze Age population. Rathlin Man lived at a moment when Ireland had become part of a much wider world. He belonged to an early Bronze Age population carrying substantial steppe-related ancestry, tracing back to peoples who had moved west from the Pontic Caspian steppe, far to the east of the continent. Yet Rathlin Man was not simply a newcomer. Within him were older layers of ancestry as well, genetic echoes of the previous layers, both the Neolithic farmers and the Western hunter-gatherers. By the Bronze Age, these different strands had fused, forming a new population. With Rathlin Man and those like him, the R1b Y chromosome haplogroup appears in Ireland for the first time, a lineage that would later become dominant across the island. Taken together, the genetic evidence shows that modern Irish ancestry derives from an early and stable blend of three prehistoric peoples: the Western hunter-gatherers, early European farmers, and steppe-derived Bronze Age peoples. A synthesis that had largely formed by around 2000 BC and remained broadly continuous thereafter. Ultimately, we see no large population replacement by Celtic Iron Age peoples or by Viking and Norman medieval populations. The genetic evidence ultimately confirmed what the archaeologists suspected. There is no support for a large-scale Celtic migration into Ireland. The genetic basis of the Irish formed early and remains continuous to this day. But the same undercurrent applies to both our language and mythology. Even to speak of Celtic mythology is not to imply closed unity. Celtic scholar Pruntius McKenna considered it as unrealistic to think that the Irish myths did not contain a substratum of pre-Celtic traditions and beliefs. The continuity of sacredness around passage tombs from the Neolithic is still evident today. People walk cautiously around the mounds of old, for they don't want to catch the attention of the good folk or the She. And the Irish sagas, such as the Town Bo Cullinge, are littered with stories of sacred kingship and warrior culture, echoing patterns seen across Indo-European traditions, possibly stretching back to the Bronze Age.
Celtic is best understood not as a people or population, but as a linguistic framework. And, in the case of its arrival onto the island, the time frame still remains debated.
As discussed, genetic evidence shows a major turning point in the Bronze Age,
Perhaps marking the first arrival of an Indo-European language ancestral to Irish, some 1,000 years before the development of the Hallstatt and Latine cultures.
So, what does this mean for ourselves today?
If you feel discouraged or unsettled by what you've seen, I ask you not to.
Because what this reveals is not a loss of identity, but a deepening of it. A connection to this land that reaches far beyond the Iron Age, stretching back through the Bronze Age, and into a continuity that has endured for over 4,000 years instead of 2. And, perhaps, in a way, the old stories understood this better than we do now. In the ancient tales, kings did not simply rule the land, they married it. Their right to rule came not from conquest, but from union with the sovereignty goddess of the land itself, a bond between people and place, renewed with each generation. When Aulmergid set foot on Ireland and spoke his famous words,
Is me on gi a
I am the wind
air
which
on
breathes
water.
upon the sea,
Is me is aulia.
I am the fairest of plants,
Is me on
I am the
Bragan
salmon
some
in the
Ishe.
water. He did not describe people arriving as strangers, but as something becoming part of the land itself. So maybe the question was never simply, are the Irish Celtic, but something more profound. like
How deep does our connection to the land of Eru really go?
4. It is a lot deeper than most were told. Whatever name or label we use, whatever change may occur in the future, our connection to the land of our ancestors will always remain.